Hello, everybody, and welcome back to This is the Year, the Swiss AI Engineering Podcast. And in this special episode, we are deep diving into ChatGPT-5 and ChatGPT, the open source version. And I think you, Joao, as my sole co-host today, because Ben is still on medical leave, you just fired a prompt. And maybe you can quickly introduce it. What did you actually do? And I think at the end of the episode, we will also be deep diving into a few notions for builders and API updates and so on and so forth. But Joao, before we get started, what did you ask ChatGPT-5 to do?
So I have Copilot here on VS Code. I have a project set up, like a basic backend front end, and I asked it to create a LangGraph agent. So I asked Copilot to create me an agent in LangGraph, pretty standard framework, I think number one used in production right now across the world. And let's see if it's any good, like if it knows the framework, because the framework is pretty recent, even though it's an AI. It's in production, it's known, but it's in the recent world, and it gets updated very often. So I told it to build me like a very basic agent in LangGraph, integrate it into the current project that I already have, and see if I end up with a working chatbot by the end of it, or if it still has some errors.
All right. I think just to lay out the context for today, we will be deep diving first into ChatGPT-5. Just some notions. I've been testing it a little bit on different edges for different use cases that I anyway have been using ChatGPT 03 for. Then we go a bit into the details on the technical side of things, especially if you're an AI builder or an AI professional or an AI student. There might be some new parameters that you can choose, especially from the API. We talk pricing, and then we look ahead into the future, maybe on open source and OpenAI, because they also released an open source model. But maybe let me set the stage quickly with what actually happened just yesterday. OpenAI did release ChatGPT-5, so the new flagship model. They also call it flagship model now in the UI. Put the screen here quickly on the UI. I think it's a nice way to quickly select between the thinking version, so the deep reasoning version, and the, let's say, a bit more faster version, ChatGPT-5, because back in the day, or basically just 2-3 days ago, I had to go through all that list of the GPT-4s, the 4.1s, the 4.5s, and the 0.3s, and whatever there was. And I think now they kind of cleaned up the UI to basically be selecting on a premium subscription, obviously, ChatGPT-5 on ChatGPT-5 thinking. From the first point of quickly yesterday's keynote, I think one thing that quickly stuck out was the new UX refinement on colors, on chat. Put also a quick screenshot on the screen here. I think this is just a small notion that you can actually, stylize the AI interaction if you like purple, blue, or whatever other color you might be choosing. I think it goes into the personality maybe also a little bit, because they did update, I think, the way GPT interacts with you. So there is some sort of new steerability on the AIs. I think that's kind of going into the products these days. So these are the first two UX updates, nothing too special, but I just thought it's a nice mix. I think, Joshua, you mentioned just a few notions also on Claude, Opus 4.1, dropped the day before, now GPT-5. What's your first take, maybe?
Every time there's a major update on one of these frontier models, whether it's OpenAI, Google, or Anthropic, the other companies feel the need to also launch their own as to not be left behind. And this was the case, so Anthropic launched 4.1, GPT-5 came, I think, a day later or 2 days later. And so it's been a very close race. And in terms of benchmarks, if you go online, especially for coding, Opus 4.1 from Anthropic is pretty neck and neck with GPT-5. In terms of pricing, I think Opus might be a bit more costly, but if you're using like an agent like you are, Cyril, or Copilot, like that abstracts things for you, so you don't really worry about the price per token. Thing is, I've been using the agents for a while. I've been liking the style of Anthropic's models, like the Claude lineup, a bit better than OpenAI. I know that in the benchmarks, OpenAI has sometimes the edge a little bit, so you can do 0.2% or like 1% better on some benchmarks. But when you send a prompt to Claude, it's very collaborative with you. So it tells you what it's gonna do, it does it, it keeps you updated along the way. It's very friendly in that sense. And OpenAI's models, at least from my experience, like 4.1 and 03 that I was using, they just do whatever you ask them to do, but they don't really check in with you or as much as Claude. They just go about their own life and try to abide by your rules. They try to do what you asked, but I don't feel as collaborative. I feel like I just gave them a task and I have to wait to the result.
I think that's
me.
Yeah, maybe I think it's a nice notion in terms of preference of like the way the conversation flows. So I kind of have the other experience that my way of talking to an AI is kind of nicely resembled in ChatGPT as opposed to maybe Gemini or Claude. So for me, this is kind of a funny thing, I think, in terms of, well, personal interaction. Something I previously just did, just for had to have some comparison. Before GPT-5 dropped, I did some deeper research into AI infrastructure investing. Quick shout out, we usually do have these finance corner segments, not in this video, but certainly in the next one once again. So I did basically this AI infra research. I was investigating high bandwidth memory companies. I was investigating basically once the reasoning is kind of initiated, what companies are kind of holding the glue together between the compute and the high bandwidth memory. There is many companies in that world, like the Microns, SK Hynix, Astera Labs, and all these things. Anyway, I was doing that on O3, and it was really nice. Of course, it gave me all the output, but I continuously had to ask to shape the output in a preferred way for me as like, well, an investor kind of, as opposed to GPT-5 quickly nailed that formatting already. It already knew that I'm probably asking these questions all the time, and it should give me the output a bit more preferred to my liking. Second point I quickly want to highlight is the reasoning depth. So I was asking this question, and it came back within 10-15 seconds with an answer, and then subsequently asked me once again, should I go back and really read all the industry reports on AI infra, go on all these different blogs and stuff for 5 minutes? And I said, yes, please go on. So GPT-5 went, came back with another more in-depth review, forward price earnings, kind of all the margin probability that's happening there. Came back once again and asked me, should I do a 48-hour deep dive into the entire industry? And I thought, this is kind of crazy. So if I say yes, it will probably reason for some sort of hours. Maybe it's less than 48 in practice. But I thought this is really a new notion that I haven't seen in O3, certainly not in other models, that it really asks me kind of down the ladder on increasing reasoning. I don't know if you saw that as well, Schwab, or
I
not
mean,
yet.
that's the thing. Like this super long reasoning, and it's good for OpenAI too, because if it's such a big like window that they can schedule these jobs around like when's less load
Yeah,
on the servers, and they don't have like
exactly.
to big spikes of CPU usage. But it's a really cool thing that, and I was reading the paper for the open source model, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what we're seeing most of the time is a log linear correlation between the compute time and the answer quality. So if it was linear, like double the time of compute would be double the answer quality. Of course, like that, it's most things in real life are not as linear as that. So it's log linear. Initially, if you spend a bit more time, you get a bit more results. And the more time you spend on that, so you have to spend almost 10 times the time. It's just 10 times the compute tokens and 10 times the compute power for, let's say, double the answer quality. And so it is interesting that they're doing that window for you. So like it's asking 5 minutes, asking 48 hours. Maybe, not sure if after this 48 hours on Monday, you'll get a message saying, hey, do you want me to research this for a whole month?
Exactly.
And then I'll get you the results.
And it goes again. I think what the point you just brought up, I actually didn't even think about it. It's basically on the pricing of cloud cost. So I think AWS, I don't know if they still have it, but they had these cloud credits or this like dynamic pricing, meaning if you're running analysis or you're using generally the cloud, for example, at 1 or 2 a.m. East Coast in the States, it might be cheaper than the daily batch, the daily job. So you could basically be scheduling all these batches for the cheapest cloud compute. I'm not sure. Feel free to drop a comment if you know that from AWS that you still can do that. But that's maybe an actual good thing for them. That's right.
It is like they have this batching capabilities. If you have a big load that you want to do, especially if you're writing some software, some agents that are supposed to analyze reports, and each agent analyzes one report, and you have 15 reports. Maybe you want the answers by tomorrow, but you don't need the answers right away. So you get like half the price. I think OpenAI and Gemini both have that ability. Like you can have half the price on tokens. It'll just take you, I think, 24 hours or 48. But I think it's 24. And you have the results stored for you online, and you can go there and check what the results were for each of those jobs. It's a pretty cool feature.
I think it's a pretty unique one. I think it's also showcasing the workflow that probably the human professionals are going to be having, right? So because currently it seems to be more in a one-shot, one-answer direction within 30 to 60 seconds, at least based on my O3 experience. But now maybe with more sophisticated reasoning and test time compute, so a lot longer, 24, 48, 72 hours, we might actually be seeing a little bit more variety of, okay, the agent goes off, does some sort of task and comes back with a result, and I can tune and tweak it. I think that's just something I saw from a private user's perspective, just on the very first day. that I thought is really, really nice. Then maybe just you mentioned quickly on the benchmark, Joao already, but ArcAGI, this is like these leading benchmarks of how good these models actually are. I think it's still significantly lower than Grok 4. I don't know if you saw that, both from...
Yeah, but there is a possibility, and like I wouldn't put it past Elon to do that, which is getting the data for these benchmarks and try to optimize it against it. So like they're reading the whole web and everything they can get to train these models. If somehow some benchmarks get leaked, then these models will know the answers. It's kind of like cheating if you're studying for a test and you get to have previous access to the test that you're going to do later. But you mentioned a thing that's, I think it's going to be pretty decisive in the future, and it's already being pretty decisive, which is the personality of these models, right? Like you mentioned that you prefer GPT, like ChatGPT over even Gemini, which is, we've been saying that had a lot better benchmarks, and on GPT-5 I think it's neck and neck. But Gemini 2.5 Pro was the best model in terms of benchmarks for a while, but people still prefer ChatGPT. I think you have like a popular opinion that is, it sounds more casual, it sounds better, it converses better with you, it's more like friendly with you over chat than 2.5 Pro. And I think this was an intentional move by OpenAI, and this is why I call them like the Tupperware of chatbots. And like people do say ChatGPT for even things that are not OpenAI at all, because it's just, I think, number one in terms of usage in chatbots. It just gets you. It writes this like profile on you that it uses later. It gets access to all the sessions. They've built a product, like the ChatGPT product, around these models that's really personal. And I think it's going to be hard for people to move away from it. So even if Anthropic has been away from most chatbots' news and functionalities because they've been focusing on business to business. So most businesses, or a lot of businesses, are using Anthropic's models. They've been optimizing for it. They've been optimizing for code writing, for example, and not really focusing on the chatbots, so selling directly to people. And I think ChatGPT did, OpenAI did, and they're ahead in the race. And even if Anthropic did a full 180 and invested a lot of time in building the best chatbot possible, they maybe could match OpenAI's chatbot functionalities and like get their style and have people like it. But you wouldn't want to move away from all the sessions you've already had with ChatGPT, all the memories you've built. Like, it just gets you now. And I think there's some kind of implicit and subtle vendor lock-in that people are just now tied to ChatGPT for a while.
As well. I think it's a really, really good point that you're making up. I think the longer I think we are sticking with one of the AIs, for example, ChatGPT, the more it knows about us. I mean, it's pretty significant if, I don't know, you're writing a book or you're building a company or you're investing, or I'm building some other, for example, next semester I'm building a new course curriculum that I'm teaching in the realm of agentic AI. And it already knows a little bit, okay, these are probably the topics you're going to cover. I'm talking about probabilistic AI, deep learning, neural networks, simple computer vision to transformer, all this stuff, it already knows. And I don't even have to initiate a new session on the next day if I'm brainstorming what should I be including and excluding from the new curriculum. And I think the more we interact with these models, the more it knows about us. I think, it basically creates even an explicit vendor lock-in from a private user's perspective, because you can't move the memories it already has about you, who you are, to the next AI. I also think I can put that prompt on the screen. You can actually ask ChatGPT what it already knows about you, and it's kind of scary because I think I've been using ChatGPT since like pretty much day one. So that's what, like almost 2 years now, and I think it's pretty unique what it knows and kind of is some sort of able to retrieve from who you actually are as a person. Maybe something that does relate to our previous video, I will put that on the screen if you're interested, regarding context engineering. We highlighted last week that context rot is a phenomenon. In other words, if these models have increasingly larger context windows, meaning you can fill these buckets with knowledge before it actually does the compute, the performance decreases. They have something called needle in a haystack tests. They're basically trying to find some sort of segment, and this segment is somewhat hidden for retrieval. And we highlighted, especially in this context, that yes, these models are kind of decreasing in performance. Now, ChatGPT-5 seems to be better than, of course, GPT-4 and all the other models. And in that sense, I think it's just a different notion probably on the context length as well. So there is not these multi-million context windows that they published. It's a little bit a lower one. But what's your take, Joao? Are these contexts getting larger, or they're kind of staying at sub 1 million, but just being improved?
That's the thing. OpenAI launched this new model, and they've been, I think it's the longest and most hyped model from OpenAI in a while. So since GPT-4, people have been talking about GPT-5, like what's next? And even Sam Altman, like in his tweets, has been teasing sometimes GPT-5, talking about it. They've launched models like 4.1 and like this open source model kind of while they were still hyping GPT-5. And GPT-5 is better than GPT-4. It's like the best model they have like from OpenAI at the moment, but it's not as close to AGI that they were promising. And that's like normal, that's like be expected. Like you wouldn't get to AGI that quickly, that fast, hopefully, because we really don't know how to handle it. But for the most hyped model, does it have the right benchmarks? Yes. Does it have the right context? I don't think so.
That's too low.
Too low because like GPT-4 was like 128k tokens, like 100,000 tokens for GPT-4. GPT-5 has 200,000. So they've doubled the window, which is pretty good. Like it is a big window. You can put a lot of context in there. You can use a lot of tools. You won't worry about 200,000 tokens that fast. Gemini has 1 million. I think it has 2 million now. And 2 million to 200,000 is still quite a bit of a gap. Of course, you're not using 1 million tokens. That'd be like a lot of different tokens. There's only some use cases where you want that much even. But just the fact that OpenAI is launching a very good model, very good benchmarks, but still not hitting the same context windows that Google has or like other open source models will have.
There must be some architectural decision, I believe. No, I mean, probably they ran some analysis on what's the typical context window people are using on ChatGPT, as opposed to maybe Gemini or the Anthropics, which might be a higher requirement on their usage. And they probably just optimized for whatever they could in terms of sizing. That's kind of my best read. I don't know. I don't think they weren't able to have a model basically able to have multi-million token context windows. They rather just probably optimize for the usage. That's just my hypothesis. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but
as I think these different companies will have now different directions or slightly different directions because now they can all do LLMs. Like that's a given now. So Anthropic is focusing on code and focusing on like selling it to businesses. OpenAI has this business side, has some government contracts, but wants to build like the best personal chatbot, whether for your personal life or your corporate life. Like it wants to have the best chatbot possible. I think Google is just doing Google. They're just building the best model possible without any given direction, at least for now. It just has the benchmarks, the best context window. It has one of the best prices. We're going to talk about it in a minute, but GPT-5 also came up with like a lot of lower prices than we were used to. So OpenAI is now very competitive on pricing.
I was actually surprised. Yeah, maybe give the highlights on the pricing. I think it is roughly 50% cheaper than 4.0. Is that correct? Or what's the high level pitch show for the GPT-5 pricing?
I mean, I'd have to compare it with GPT-4.0, but I remember that Google was by far the lowest on pricing. If you put it on a table with y-axis being intelligence and x-axis being price per token, Google was on a corner by its own, like really smart, but also really cheap. And now you have GPT-5 with almost the exact same pricing. GPT-5 and 2.5 Pro from Google have the exact same pricing on input and output. The only thing that they differ really is the context window. And even then, like I said, you're not going to use more than 200,000 tokens, only on some very specific use cases, because you run the risk, like we talked about with context rot, where you just have too much context or you have the wrong context and you're going to trick the model into doing the wrong thing. So amazing and surprising that OpenAI has been able to launch this top model at such an affordable and competitive price regarding to Google. Even, and GPT-5, I think they call it Mini, they call it Mini.
I think the other ones, yeah.
Is the same pricing as Gemini 2.5 Flash, and I think even a bit cheaper. So it's like 30 cents to 25 cents. Like the difference is not massive, but it is still a bit cheaper than 2.5 Flash. And this is a very big difference for OpenAI, and it highlights the thing we talked about since the beginning of the podcast. If you're building these types of AI agents, you should, of course, optimize it to whatever LLM you're using it, but you should be able to jump ship and change what LLM is running on the background on a given day. So maybe you're in Google saying, oh, Google is like the best and the cheapest, and now you have like a very competitive offer from OpenAI. Maybe you'd want to use that one. Maybe they have a new feature that you want to use. And so being able to jump ship and to use whatever LLM you want, regardless of your infrastructure, regardless of what your agent is doing, I think will keep you afloat and will give you access to the best models and best features at any given time.
I think it's a really great point. Maybe before we wrap up the GPT-5 segments, I saw a tweet. I don't know if that's true, but it was apparently trained on between 170 to 180,000 from NVIDIA, meaning the actual previous generation chips. We also talked about them multiple times. The newer models, hopefully Grok 5, GPT-6, or whatever else is coming after, will be trained on the new Blackwell chips from NVIDIA. So they are automatically be getting better, because I had some quick discussion yesterday around, okay, this is the best model for the foreseeable future? Probably not. So with these new Blackwells going online in all these hyperclusters around the world, I think the next models will be even better. I think that's just the last read maybe on ChatGPT-5. I overall, just from my personal sentiment, like the way it works. GPT-5 thinking, and it also has nano and mini, as you mentioned, Joao, perfectly. Please have model flexibility. Don't just work everything around for example, ChatGPT and then a Gemini or even an open source. And now we're probably segueing into the open source discussion quickly. Is coming along. You can't switch models. So let's shift gear quickly into the open source discussion. OpenAI, aside from GPT, one day before also launched a new open source model. What's the read from your end, Joao? And I do have my fair bites to say here as well.
They managed to launch a pretty good model. I mean, they've been hyping it also for a while. I think OpenAI has been the hype king of LLMs. I think it's the traction that Sam Altman gets. But people were really happy with the Queen models. People were pretty happy with the Llama models when they were coming out. And they were not hating, but throwing shade, let's say, at OpenAI for delaying this open source launch for a while. And they've been delaying it, I think, for a month now.
Since day one, since they became closed source.
And when they finally do it, people are saying, oh, they're going to delay it because it's not as good as what's out there. And it was. Like the open source model from OpenAI, they call it GPT OSS. It is as good as the best open source models out there. So it is beating DeepSeek and not DeepSeek V2, they don't call it that, like the DeepSeek R1 0528, if you want to call it the technical name for it. Like the best DeepSeek model is slightly worse than this new GPT OSS. It has really good features. It is light in terms of it can be run on some reasonably affordable hardware. Like they said, the minor version can be run on a laptop, on a phone. The big version can be run on a laptop. It won't be fast on a laptop, so don't expect to have ChatGPT running on your own personal device. It won't be as fast. But the fact that it fits, the fact that they managed to build such a capable model with so few tokens, it's pretty impressive. Like I was saying, you have this log linear correlation between the compute time that you spend on it, because it is a reasoning model. So you can be spending more time on compute, get a bit better answers, but then you get diminishing results the more compute you spend. And it is beating DeepSeek. People are really happy with the Queen models also from Alibaba, and that launches us to this open question, and this is like for the viewers, for the listeners, and also to you, Cyril, because I think you have an opinion on this, is open source has been having new models, and seeing new models coming out every couple of weeks. Maybe every month there's a new major model, like a new major open source model. And I'm wondering, and I have no idea actually, if OpenAI is gonna keep launching open source models or keep updating this GPT OSS, or if they're good enough, like if this OSS was just a PR stunt to get people off their back about being closed source.
Maybe, yeah.
And they're gonna let the Alibaba with the Queen models just get ahead, get DeepSeek, do new DeepSeek models coming out, and just beat them in terms of performance and benchmarks. I mean, do you have an idea what's gonna happen?
I probably have a theory / hypothesis. I'm not affiliated in any sort with OpenAI's
We're not sponsored.
Platform strategy, not sponsored. But just to wrap up the context, you mentioned that many open source models are being released, and they're most of the time being released in the eastern hemisphere of the world, meaning in China. So many open source models are actually not being pushed from the West necessarily. We have the mental model in the West that we mostly work on competition, which is great. So we have model competition, but we're mostly closing up. So we don't really have a large collaborative ecosystem. There is OpenAI, there is Anthropic, they're both closed. Mistral, some smaller model providers that have been, again, mostly closed. The East is a lot different. So China has this open source, I think, notion since many years. I think even since the years of Linux. Red Hat and so on and so forth. So they really are adopting open source in a completely different mental framing than we do in the West. So that's why I believe the shipping velocity on China open source is a lot faster. So you mentioned we have Moonshot, we have Alibaba, we have all these different Chinese players that are just pushing the models, but they're also building on top of them. So I think that's a different notion that we have in the West. Meaning, if, for example, Kimi came out by Moonshot, I'm pretty sure all the other competitors like DeepSeek, Alibaba, and whatever else, they're distilling the models and they're trying to augment their own open source whatever, 7 or 8 that's coming next. So there's really this collaborative ecosystem on open source in the East. In the West, we don't really have that. That being said, I think if you are a Western builder, being a professional, a consultant, basically be advising which models to choose, I think you want to have still some sort of accountability on the model providers. Meaning today, in today's world, since most of the great models so far without OpenAI came from the East, you still had to go through a Chinese vendor or at least a Chinese institution if there was some sort of reliability or some sort of security issues or any other due diligence you want to do. Now with these new models coming up in the West, to answer your question very broadly, Joao, I think it is a great way that we have now basically 2 major players, hopefully in the open source world, OpenAI and Meta, because they might be the actual focal point for Western companies building on open source. This is just a theory. So I do think they are keeping to push that, not only because of being the focal topic, but they also have some sort of brand recognition. If they're doing something, they will be attracting users. And I think this is just opening maybe a different gateway. You briefly mentioned it beforehand, Joao, in the sense of Anthropic being mostly B2B, that yes, these open source models by OpenAI might also be now basically be pushed a little bit into the B2B world. That's just another hypothesis. So I do think it's a great notion also to acquire and attract new talent, because we've seen Meta is poaching a lot of the talent of OpenAI. Maybe for that reason, you guys are working closed, come work at Meta and you work at open source, because it's mostly philosophical question for developers.
When people started saying meta poaching, they also started like hypothesizing, well, if they have the best guys and have the budget, they're gonna start doing closed source. So we haven't been seeing new llama models in a while, where Meta has been pretty quiet in the news world about their models. So we might be seeing like a closed source model from Meta in the very near future.
And more open from OpenAI.
Yeah,
so
the tables are flipped now.
The tables are flipped. So what's the last notion? You think they are keeping to push open source, or that was the last one, if you had to guess?
I think for now it was to calm like the PR storm that was happening about them being very closed and very profitable, let's say. I mean, they have government contracts, they have some relation with Palantir, which doesn't have the best PR in the world, but we'll see. I mean, I'm hoping to see more open source models, especially from the West. I'm thinking that, especially with your theory, that China has a lot of more collaborative culture and they can build upon each other's models. Maybe we'll get to AGI first, which would be...
as you said, yeah, they're faster, right? If you can compound knowledge every, 2 months with a new model that's just open source, I think they are really leapfrogging the way in the East, as long as they have some sort of funding. Because that's the other notion, like how many companies can build a multi-billion-dollar open source model just from scratch? I mean, you have to have some sort of funding behind you that you can build these large language models that are capable of that. And I don't know how the Chinese incentivization structure currently works, but there might be some sort of incentives to build open source with maybe some ease of capital access. And in the West, there's just a few of the handful companies that can actually be doing that. Meta, they cross-finance it with the other businesses, and OpenAI as well. So they might have this ChatGPT B2C product that's basically be cross-financing the open source, basically like Amazon did with AWS, right? So there was Amazon with a retail business, and they just basically be funded AWS for all these years. Maybe that's my last to read. They do have the money, and I think it's a wise way, Sam Altman, to go forward.
I mean, we're hoping to see open source. I mean, it's very good not only for research and academic purposes, but also it pushes new competitors into the space. We don't want to have 4 or 5 different companies dominating the space like we have in the cloud world, like we have pretty much everywhere in whatever industry sector you want to pick. The more competitors we have, like the better the prices will be, because we've talked about Gemini and Google having the best pricing, OpenAI matching that best pricing. And it always been hypothesized that Google somehow was losing money on this because they couldn't be that much cheaper than everyone else. And they were doing this to get market, and then they're going to increase the prices. And now OpenAI is doing this also on the pricing. Not sure if they're copying the model of they're actually losing money on this API costs being so low, and they're going to launch it and make it way bigger in the future. Or have they found a way to make this and run these models so efficiently and so light that they can actually afford and be profitable with these low API costs?
I think maybe before we wrap up, just to add on one nuance to that point, I mean, it's also worth noting that Google, they have their own TPUs. So they have their own chip infrastructure. They anyway have that for YouTube transcription, like all this like voice to text and whatever
They've had
other services they have.
decades worth of hardware development in-house for these things. So how in the hell is OpenAI mashing it? They have to be cutting something, or they have the best deal ever with Microsoft Azure to have low-cost GPUs.
Or they're losing money. I mean, it's not the public company. I think I saw some notions on, them burning cash, right? So it's not that, I don't know how profitable, feel free to challenge me in the comments on this. Currently, OpenAI is, especially if they're building these models at this rapid rate and they don't have their own proprietary cloud, because they have to rely on Azure and other cloud providers. Whereas Google, they have their own TPUs, their own infrastructure. Arguably, and that's just a hypothesis, makes also training and inference hopefully a lot cheaper by them. Because you mentioned a really good point, just to wrap up maybe the episode as well. If you achieve a model construction, be an open source, a closed source, whatever, that's 90% on par with Grok or OpenAI GPT-5, but 90% cheaper. So it's almost as intelligent as the closed model, but it's 90% cheaper. And most of the companies, they will probably take the deal at any given second, especially for most of the tasks. And then the more complicated tasks, they might be quickly looping in a GPT-5, a Claude Opus 4.1, Sonnet 4.1, and one other expensive model maybe from XAI for this particular task. And for all the others, the guard railings, the quick ones, they just use this cheaper one that's 90% the price, a discount as opposed to the bigger model. So that's kind of why I believe they have to lower the prices. Otherwise, this might be happening increasingly more. That's my last guess. Great. I think, Joao, you also have two more notions. What came out of the prompt at the beginning on ChatGPT-5 LangChain?
I should check it out. Let's see how's that going. And also from GPT-5 launch, not open source model, their own API, OpenAI has this ability. If you're a builder, you can leverage these options, which is you can set the reasoning effort. They call it reasoning effort. Google has had this for a while. They call it reasoning budget. Basically, how much do you want the model to think? And maybe you want some quick thinking, some quick reasoning. Maybe you want 40 hours, like Cyril does, of reasoning and research.
Forever, yeah.
And yeah, you can control this now. And depending on your task, on how complex that the use case is, you can divide this effort and you can pretty much adjust the budget according to your own budget, your own cloud costs that you want to achieve. So it's a pretty good ability to have on the GPT-5. Not just let it think as much as it wants, but you can actually control how much it's thinking.
It's super also easy. It's just to jump in quickly. Reasoning equals curly braced effort minimal. That's the only line of code you need to add. Other than minimal, I don't even know what the configuration option were. Have you checked that already? I haven't yet.
The values, I have to go on the documentation, but they have I think at least 3 different, in the papers, they have 2 different levels of thinking, but you might have a numerical value that you can use and have as many options as you want. But also another field that Google doesn't have it is the verbosity. So you've had this maximum tokens field on most APIs, which you can set for the maximum length of the answer. Maybe the answer was shorter, like if you set the length to 1,000 tokens. Maybe the answer was only 100, so a couple sentences was good enough. Maybe it was a whole paragraph. But if it reached that maximum limit that you set, it would just stop generating. It would stop computing. It wouldn't change much of the model style. If you want it to be concise, and this is a thing, like if you go on ChatGPT, you know these models are verbose. They talk for a very long time. They have a lot of text output. And if you want it to have shorter answers, you'd have to have it in the prompt on your request or on the system prompt to say, be concise or be short or answer in only a couple sentences. Otherwise, these models would go off and just rant about things. And now you can have that on the API directly and set the verbosity. So you can set the model to actually write as much as possible. If you want to report, that'd be a good thing. But if you want a quick answer about something, if you want a yes or no question, especially for the use cases that you like for agentic AI, you can set the verbosity to low and have an automatic, and this is like fine-tuned into the model, an automatic lowering of output costs and output tokens, and not only have a faster answer because it finishes its output faster, and also better inference costs, and probably a better answer for your use case if you want something short. So these two fields, I think, make it a really, really competitive offer right now for builders.
These are the API and parameters, just to mention again. So that's basically what you can be doing both in Mini and Nano as well, or is it just in
I think it's across GPT-5, but I could double check.
I think it was for all five. I think the fourth notion, maybe before we fully wrap it up in the episode, I think it's the cool tool called preambles. So basically, before the agent goes off and executes a particular task, it some sort of gives a script of what it is going to do. And I think this is also kind of a nuanced way to steer a little bit in actionality, actually. So it's called a tool called preambles. They were, I think, present before, but now I think you can have some sort of more influence over the execution of the tool calling. So that's maybe just to wrap it up fully. Okay,
and I finally have, you were asking about like the results of GPT-5, and I finally have the results, and it is pretty good. To be short, it's pretty good.
Sounds like you're fully convinced with ChatGPT.
I mean, I have to test it more, but Anthropic has had this thing where people complain that the model tries to do too much. You ask for a button, you end up with 3, and somehow your backend changed, like you're using a new database. And it's important to keep it in scope. Like, you don't want it to half-ass your code and just write half the function and just say the rest goes here. That'd be bad. But also you don't want it to get a bit too ambitious and start changing the random things. So I gave it a prompt. I was checking out the code while Cyril was monologuing, and it seems pretty concise. Like, and it did what I wanted to do. It added one extra feature that is very valuable to what I did, to what I wanted to achieve. And I gotta check, like, do a bit of code review so to see if it wrote anything like good. But so far, in terms of verbosity, in terms of what I actually wanted to do, it hit all the checkpoints that I wanted.
And now you could fire it back. You would say, okay, it sounds really good from the first inning. Please go back, review it for 15 more minutes. It will do that. Come back. Please do it again. 48 hours. I'm running over the weekend. It's Friday that we are shooting the episode. Please come back on Sunday. And on Sunday, maybe reviewed the whole code base, maybe found some other bugs, came back with a suggested way of integrating that feature, and so on and so forth. So I believe this is like a really good way also to maybe wrap up the episode. This might be the new agentic workflows that we have been talking about, or everybody in the world have been talking about for all the year. But I think this is the first time that as a private individual, especially without maybe using a Copilot or without using Cursor and V0s and the vibe coding tools of the world, that you can be interacting even with code generation within the actual user interface. You can run the code as well on ChatGPT-5 itself's UX. I actually haven't mentioned that before, but you can also be doing that. So simple games, simple like stuff that you would want to be building within ChatGPT is also running and compiling within itself. What was your one highlight, Joao? If you think about ChatGPT-5, before we wrap up the episode, one single highlight that you thought this was pretty good.
So far, I think the verbosity, the ability to actually change the verbosity of the model. People have no idea how hard it is to, like, if you're a builder, to control how verbose these models are. Because if you set in the prompt, for example, and like people, if you're not a builder, you don't have an idea. But if you say to the model, be concise, but also in another line of the prompt, be polite, to the model, these are two conflicting statements. Because being polite sometimes is saying, hey, how are you? Thank you. Like, it's having more words on your message, and be concise goes directly against it. So you can say be polite, and in the API you can set it to be concise, and it can like maybe generate a better version of a polite version, but something that doesn't cost you too much on cloud inference.
Good point. I think my best point, and I have to test that over the next few weeks, is the longer context window reliability. Let's see if that is actually true, because this Chroma research that we were mentioning was of course not run on GPT-5. So let's see how these context windows are really getting. I think that's when we have the best use cases within AI, when these context windows are really, really reliable, of course, on top of every other thing. But that's really the missing part. Multi-million context windows, or even 250,000 that are incredibly precise and reliable. So that was it for GPT-5's wrap up. Of course, it was just the first day of experimenting with the models on different notions and different use cases. Thank you, Joao, for joining yet again. Just for the audience, we shoot these episodes every single week. We try to upload at least once a week, and everything that is in regard to AI, of course, with the new models, AI engineering principles and theories and best practices, we will be covering on this podcast. This is the year, because it is. We saw it again. New models are coming out. So thank you, Joao, and we see each other in the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.
See you next week.